In this camera exposure basics video, we're going to take a look at one of the mainstays of the exposure triangle, aperture. Aperture, also known as f-stop, controls the amount of light that comes through your lens and reaches your sensor. Along with shutter speed and ISO, it's one of the three controls that we have to regulate exposure. The aperture on your lens is like a leaf shutter that can be opened and closed according to the amount of light in our scene. It can be controlled manually by the photographer or automatically by the camera. At its most open point, it's called maximum aperture and will let in the maximum amount of light. Depending on lens, a maximum aperture may be somewhere between f1.4 and f4. Lenses with apertures of f2.8 or greater are often called fast lenses, but can be quite expensive. It's important to remember that in photographic terms, the smaller the f-stop number, the bigger the aperture is. When the aperture is smallest, it's called minimum aperture, and this lets in the least amount of light. On most lenses, this is around f16 to f22. Aperture is the primary control for depth of field, the amount of the image that is in focus in front of and behind our subject. When we have a wide aperture, for example f2.8, less will be in focus in front of and behind our subject. As we close the aperture down, also known as stopping down, more and more of the image will come into focus. This is a very useful thing to know from a creative point of view. Here's why. At wider apertures, for example f1.4 or f2, we can have a shallow depth of field and what is known as bokeh. Bokeh is a term given to the way the out of focus parts of an image look. Wide apertures are ideal for low light situations as they allow us to use a high enough shutter speed to hand-hold the camera. Mid-range apertures such as f2.8 through to f5.6 are ideal for portraits, sports and wildlife. The latter two are where you need to keep a relatively high shutter speed due to the motion, but also want some parts of the image to be in focus behind the subject. Apertures of f11 to f16 are ideal for landscapes, where you want a lot of the image to be in focus, from the foreground to the background. From f16 down to f22 or f32, we are in the realms of long exposure shots, where our shutter speeds can last into minutes. Understanding aperture and its effect on an image will open up many creative possibilities for you. From the creamy bokeh of an ultra-wide aperture to the deep depth of field of a very small aperture. I hope that you've enjoyed this video. My name's Jason Rowe, and I'll see you again soon.
Hi Photo One. So to continue our discussion about aperture, we're going to be exploring for our second camera assignment the concept of the toy stories. So the adventures of the traveling trinket. So for this assignment, you just need something small. It does not have to be necessarily a children's toy. It could be some kind of an ornament, you know, from like a Christmas tree, or it could be some kind of decoration, something from Halloween, like a small, just about the size of your fist, something that you can take around with you and try different backgrounds in order to really capture this concept of aperture and aperture priority mode on our class cameras. So the idea of aperture is that this small opening inside the lens of your camera can either be very small, as in f16, or very large, as in f2.8, and that controls several things. So number one, the aperture controls how much light is entering your camera. So if you have a very small opening, obviously not much light is going to be getting in. It might end up being like a darker picture. And then if you have a wide opening, obviously a lot of light is going to flood in. So you have to have very fast shutter speeds, and these work together, as you saw in the other video, in order to create that exposure triangle, which controls whether or not your photograph is well exposed and has enough light. The other thing that aperture controls is something called depth of field. So this refers to how much of your scene is in focus from the nearest object to the furthest object in acceptably sharp focus. So in these two examples, you can see here that a smaller f number like f16 with it's a bigger number, but it's a smaller opening, would result in a greater depth of field. So this is something that can kind of stump a lot of beginner photographers. It just takes some practice. It really works the best with DSLR cameras, but those of you at home can absolutely still use your cell phone cameras to get that range of focus. You just may need to get closer to something, and remember to like touch your screen on the part that you want to be in focus. So in these two examples, the first egg is in focus in both of them, but the main difference is how many other eggs are in focus from here to the background. So in the F16 picture, you can see a lot more of the scene is in focus. These types of apertures work really well for landscapes, architecture photography, anywhere, anything where you really want everything to be in focus from the nearest to the furthest object in your scene. And then f2.8 or wider aperture openings with that shallower depth of field. You think of like stepping into the shallow end of a swimming pool, not much is in focus. That works really well for portraits, where you really want the emphasis in your scene to be on just one thing. So there's several photographers that do this really well. One photographer that experiments with this idea of not just the aperture in order to create blur and selective focus, but also the idea of the Toy Story, following, the vibrant lives and adventures of toys. Think about, going on an adventure in your own backyard, making things that are very small look very gigantic in comparison to the trinkets or the small things that you choose to use. So Mark Hogenkamp is actually a photographer that's still working to this day. And he got his start actually as a stage set designer. And then he unfortunately suffered a traumatic brain injury, which left him with a lot to learn, to relearn in his life. And he almost approached it the way a child would, through toys and play. So he actually is a very talented carpenter as well. So he set up a whole 1/4 scale World War II village in his backyard where he creates these mannequins, and he kind of takes them on adventures and photographs their journeys. And his work is now in many prominent galleries around the New York area, because his work is just so unique and so authentic in the way that he relates to the world. He's also a veteran too, so it relates to him on a personal level as well. So this is an example of toys brought to life with the magic of photography. You might be familiar with the traveling gnome if you remember from advertisements from Travelocity when you're younger. The idea was he was going to all these exotic places and then sending postcards with the gnome always in front of this background. So the question would be, what background do you want your object to be in front of? And it doesn't have to be, like I said, a toy that's personified. It could be like an artificial rose, or it could be something that, like a garden ornament, like this garden gnome here. So it doesn't have to necessarily be a toy or have a face, but those just add for more adventures, I think, if it does seem to have a little bit of personification to it as well. Also, you can play with your food. If that's something that you're allowed to do at home, feel free to create these foodscapes and play with toys in combination with, climbing this mountain of mashed potatoes can be a really creative way to a creative angle to take this project. And of course, travel photographs are instantly better, and any kind of photographs are instantly better with dinosaurs. So we'll be looking a little bit more closely at how to use Photoshop in this project. So if you want to Photoshop your toys into more elaborate scenes, you still have to take all of your own pictures. So I don't want to see any like pictures of Europe if you've never been there, obviously. So they have to be your own pictures, but you can definitely use Photoshop to kind of blur the lines between reality and your imagination. Here's just a few student examples using depth of field. So shallow depth of field, again, can create that emphasis on just one thing, in this case, the artificial flowers. And then here the student used another student's artwork in the background. It happened to be on display in the gallery at the time in order to blur the background and really set the scene and make the focal point stand out.